Ambassador Chen walked to the chamber entrance, while Counselor Dethron was still mid-sentence. The chamber went quiet the way a machine goes quiet when someone finds the off switch. 1,200 representatives sat in tiered rings above her, and every eye cluster in the room turned toward one human woman in a grey coat who had not raised her voice at all. "Councillor Dethron," she said, "I'd like to address your proposal." Dethron's crest of silver filaments lifted, the concorded equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He had just finished suggesting that the council seize whatever the humans had brought with them. 437 ships sat outside the station now, and he had called that number a negotiating tactic. "You can take our diplomatic personnel," Chen said. "You can probably take our 12 diplomatic vessels if your military assets at this coordinate move immediately. You cannot take 300 years of predecessor research, because it exists in distributed archives across 8,000 star systems, in regions your hyperlane network doesn't reach." The wrong detail landed quiet and small. She wasn't threatening him. She was doing math out loud, the way a teacher corrects a student's homework. "What you can do," Chen said, "is the thing I came here to offer. A genuine partnership between two civilizations that each have what the other needs." She looked at Dethron for exactly 3 seconds. Then she sat down. The chamber did not move. 600 delegates were doing the same calculation Dethron was doing, and none of them liked the number they were getting. Somewhere above the dais, a status feed updated in silence. 3 concorded capital ships, repositioning. The tactical officer who read it did not report it out loud. He didn't need to. Admiral Sothkavar's fleet had tried to move into a better position an hour ago and found the human fleet already sitting in every position that mattered. Nobody in the chamber knew yet whether Dethron would answer her. That question would wait. It had started 9 days earlier, and it had started small. Threshold Station 9 had logged something like 400 million sensor events in 800 years of service. 47 of those had needed a human, a concorded rather, to actually look at them. 39 were equipment failures. 7 were known ships from known civilizations, running known routes. One was a junior analyst who had once mistaken a gravity well for a warship and never lived it down. The 142nd day of Galactic Year 7312 produced the 48th. Wath Vethkor ran his thumb along the edge of his datapad, the way he always did when a reading didn't sit right. The groove had worn smooth years ago, a habit that had outlasted 3 different pads. He was midway through the overnight cataloging cycle, the same cycle he ran most nights, when the proximity alarm fired. He almost dismissed it. That was the detail nobody would remember later, the detail Wath himself would think about for years. For 3 full seconds, he assumed it was another malfunction. Number 40. Then he read the numbers again. "Send me the sensor log," he said to the station's night operator, a concorded named Prashk who mostly handled maintenance flags and had never once fielded a first contact event. Not the summary, the raw feed. Prashk sent it. Wath read it twice. "There are 14 confirmed contacts," Prashk said, "possibly more at the edge of range. They're displaying FTL drive signatures." "That's not the strange part," Wath said. "Where's the hyperlane they came in on?" Prashk checked, then checked again. "There isn't one. They appeared from a bearing with no hyperlane." Nobody said anything for a moment. On a station that had logged 400 million events, this had never happened before. The Concorded had been mapping the galaxy's hyperlane network for 3,000 years. Every civilization capable of faster-than-light travel had come from somewhere on that map. There was no map for where these contacts had come from. Wath filed the most urgently classified report Threshold Station 9 had issued in 800 years and called the Records Archive. Archivist Vethrin liked her job for a reason most people found strange. She liked that the answer was always in there somewhere. 3,000 years of concorded record-keeping meant that every civilization, every ship class, every diplomatic incident had a file. You just had to search correctly. She typed the sensor signature into the active civilization registry. Not found. She tried the developing civilization registry, the one for species still working toward the stars. Not found. She tried the pre-FTL observation archive, the one for species the Concorded were quietly watching from a distance, waiting for them to grow up. Not found. She tried the historical extinction records, in case this was some strange echo of a civilization that no longer existed. Not found. She tried the predecessor study database, on a hunch that made no sense even as she typed it. Not found. 5 searches. 5 different databases spanning 3,000 years of comprehensive record keeping. Vethrin sat back from her terminal and said the sentence out loud, to no one, because she needed to hear it in a voice that wasn't just text on a screen. Not found in any registry, not found anywhere. The records, which had always had answers, had nothing. She called Wath back within the hour. Whatever these 14 contacts are, she said, they are not in our history, not as a civilization we've watched, not as one we've lost, not as one we've ever recorded meeting. Then what are they? I don't know yet, but I found something else while I was looking. There's a flagged entry from 847 years ago. Survey notation 712 gamma. She sent him the file. Wath read the summary twice, the way he'd read the sensor log twice, because some things needed a second look before they became real. A Concorded survey vessel, 847 years ago, had briefly observed a pre-FTL, industrial-age species on a single world, catalogued their technological trajectory, and projected first faster-than-light flight in 1800 to 2200 years. Follow-up observation had never been scheduled. The file had simply closed itself, the way old files did, and waited in an archive nobody read. 847 years since anyone looked, Vethrin said. If this is the same species, they beat that projection by well over 800%. Neither of them said the next part out loud yet, because neither of them wanted to be the one who said it first. Nobody had checked. For 847 years, an entire civilization had been growing in the dark, and the only reason the Concorded didn't know was that nobody had gone back to look. The diplomatic contact team transmitted on 22 frequencies, the standard opening protocol for an unregistered species, expecting the usual thing. Silence, confusion, maybe a garbled signal requiring translation work. The response arrived in 11 seconds. It came back in 17 of the Concorded's active languages, each with correct grammar, accurate technical vocabulary, and idiomatic phrasing that no translation engine produced on a first try. Whoever had written this response hadn't been guessing at Concorded language. They had known it, the way you know a language you've studied for years. We would appreciate the opportunity to speak with the senior leadership of this governing body at their earliest convenience, the message said. We have something important to discuss. The signature line read, Ambassador Chen, on behalf of the United Outer Systems. Wath read that message standing beside Vethrin's terminal, thumb resting on the worn groove of his datapad, and felt something shift that had nothing to do with sensor data. Whoever these people were, they had not been surprised to find the Concorded. They had been waiting for the Concorded to find them. Ambassador Chen's message sat on Vethrin's screen for 11 minutes before anyone in senior leadership answered it. I'll be honest, what came next kept station personnel awake for 3 shifts straight, and some of them never quite slept the same after. Stay with it. Wath read the reply over the comms officer's shoulder. Senior leadership had agreed to a meeting at a coordinate the humans themselves proposed, 7 hours out from the station. Nobody at Threshold Station 9 had expected to be told where to go. Usually the Concorded set the meeting point. This time they didn't get the chance. 7 hours, Vethrin said. That's not a long trip for a species we've never met. It's not a long trip if you already know exactly where our fleet staging point is, Wath said. Neither of them liked the implication sitting behind that sentence. He filed it away, the same way he filed the proximity alarm, a small wrong thing that would need an answer later. Vethrin kept digging. She had the kind of mind that couldn't leave a gap alone, and survey notation 712 Gamma had left a very large gap. She pulled records of every observation post the Concorded had ever staffed near that stretch of space, cross-referenced staffing logs, budget allocations, follow-up requests. What she found wasn't a conspiracy. It was worse. It was nothing. A single junior surveyor had logged the sighting, recommended a follow-up in the standard 20-year window, and then the request had simply aged out of the queue behind more urgent business over and over for 8 centuries. No one covered it up, she told Wath. No one even remembered it was there. Not found in any registry, Wath said, half to himself. Not because it was hidden, because no one went back to look. The comms officer interrupted, headset in hand. Ambassador Chen wants to confirm something before the meeting. She's asking whether Threshold Station 9 has, quote, up-to-date figures on our territory. Wath almost laughed, though nothing about it was funny. Tell her we don't have any figures on her territory. We don't know it exists. The reply came back within the minute, and it was Chen's own voice this time, translated cleanly, warm in a way that made the whole thing worse. We've been in the outer regions for 300 years, she said. Our territory extends through 8,000 star systems out there, in areas your network doesn't reach. Give or take, we're still expanding. Vethrin sat very still after that. 300 years, 8,000 systems, a species the Concorded had projected as pre-FTL, still riding animal power on a single world, less than a millennium ago. They didn't come from nowhere, she said. They came from everywhere we never bothered to check. The meeting coordinate turned out to be empty space, 7 hours out, with nothing marking it but a small relay buoy no larger than a shuttle. Admiral Sothkavar arrived first, the way protocol demanded, with 6 capital ships arranged to establish what his orders called a dominant political framework for the encounter. 6 ships, standard doctrine, more than enough to make an unregistered species understand who they were dealing with. Then the humans arrived. They didn't cross space the way Concorded ships did, in a slow crawl of drive flare visible for minutes before arrival. One moment the boy sat alone. The next, the dark around it was full. 437 ships, 86 of them built for war, hulls shaped in patterns Concorded targeting systems couldn't classify, running on drive signatures that matched nothing in 800 years of naval intelligence. Sothkavar's tactical officer ran the classification query 3 times, because the first 2 results came back the same way Vethrin's search had. Not found. Sothkavar stood on his flag bridge and watched the number climb on his display, and somewhere in that watching, the framework he had brought with him quietly stopped being dominant. He opened a channel. This is Admiral Sothkavar, representing the Concorded Council. We request a parley under standard protocol. The answer came from a single vessel near the center of the formation, no larger than his own flagship. This is Ambassador Chen. Parley accepted. We'd like to bring 1 delegation aboard your station, if that's acceptable. We have some things to show you. Sothkavar agreed, because there wasn't a version of refusing that looked like strength anymore. Chen's delegation was small. Herself, a translator who turned out not to be needed, and a woman named Dr. Reyes who carried a single data case and said almost nothing until she was asked to. They sat in Threshold Station, 9's largest conference room, which had never hosted more than a routine trade delegation before, and Chen opened with the sentence that ended up in every subsequent council transcript. We didn't come here to negotiate our survival, she said. We came here to offer you assistance with yours. Wath watched from the observation gallery, thumb against the worn groove of his datapad, and understood he was hearing something that would outlast every one of the 400 million routine events the station had logged before it. Dr. Reyes opened her case and set out a stack of survey findings. In 300 years, she said, we've catalogued 3,700 predecessor sites across the outer regions. Silence took the room the way it had taken the council chamber later, a silence with a particular quality, the kind that comes when a number lands somewhere it can't be unheard. The Concorded have found 14 predecessor sites, Wath said before he could stop himself. It wasn't a question. He already knew the count. He'd filed the report on the last one himself. 14, Reyes agreed. In 3,000 years. Nobody needed to say the rest out loud. 3,000 years of comprehensive record-keeping had covered a fraction of what was actually out there, and the fraction it had missed was larger than the fraction it had found. Chen let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then she said the thing that turned the whole meeting into something else entirely. There's a reason we came now, and not 50 years ago or 100 years from now. There's something moving through the dark that your civilization catalogued 3,000 years ago and then quietly stopped watching. We call it the Veil. It's been routing around predecessor infrastructure for longer than either of our civilizations has existed, and it just changed course. Wath's hand went still on the datapad. Changed course toward what? Sothgavar asked. Toward you, Chen said. 35 to 45 years by our best modeling, first contact with a concorded world. The energy in the room after that didn't spike. It dropped, the particular flatness of people absorbing something too large to react to immediately. Reyes filled the quiet with the next fact, gently, the way you hand someone a chair before telling them to sit down. The predecessor sites aren't ruins, she said. They're infrastructure. Every one we've mapped is part of a single network, a fence, built to redirect the veil away from populated systems. We've spent 100 years learning to read it. We only recently learned to replicate the signal. A fence, Wath repeated. An incomplete one, Ray said. 14 nodes on your side of the network have never been activated because no one ever knew they needed to be. A partial fence doesn't stop the veil. It just tells the veil where the gap is. Chen let the silence hold a moment longer before she spoke again, quieter now. We didn't come here because we need your permission to survive. We've been building toward this for 300 years with or without you. We came because the fence only works if it's whole, and 14 of the missing pieces are sitting in territory only you have access to. Wath thought, not for the first time that day, about a junior surveyor 847 years dead, who had logged one small sighting and then watched it age quietly out of a queue. He thought about the 14 dead nodes sitting somewhere in concorded space, uncounted the same way that survey had gone uncounted, waiting for someone to come back and look. The wrong detail from 9 days ago, the alarm he'd almost dismissed as malfunction 40, didn't feel small anymore. Sothgavar broke the silence first, and what he said would be repeated back to him for years. I came out here with 6 ships to establish dominance over an unregistered species. You did, Chen said, not unkindly. I don't think that's what this is anymore. No, Chen said, it isn't. Dethron's faction had already convened before Chen's ship crossed into concorded home space, and their conclusion arrived a full 6 hours before the humans did. Confiscate the technology, Dethron told the assembled block, 7'4" and speaking in the low subsonic register that meant he wasn't asking. Whatever they bring aboard this station, it becomes property of the Council the moment it crosses our border. 300 years of research doesn't belong to a species we've never registered. 187 representatives murmured agreement. It was, Wath thought, watching the feed from Threshold Station 9's relay, the kind of plan that worked perfectly as long as nobody on the other side had spent 300 years preparing for exactly this reaction. He wasn't there for it. He'd been recalled to observe the proceedings from a data terminal, a duty officer with no formal standing in a council chamber, watching history happen through a screen the way he'd watched the proximity alarm 9 days ago. His thumb found the groove on his datapad without him deciding to move it. Vethrins sat beside him, watching the same feed, They don't know what they're about to try to take, she said. Neither did we, 9 days ago. The council chamber sat at the administrative heart of concorded space, a structure 800 years older than Threshold Station 9, built to hold 1,200 representatives in tiered rings around a central floor. Chen's delegation arrived through the main doors with the same quiet, unhurried pace they'd shown at the buoy, at the station, everywhere. Speaker Ashavorn opened the session with a standard greeting protocol, the one used for every unregistered species in 3,000 years of first contact. Chen listened to all of it, patiently, and answered with the sentence that had already reached every corner of concorded media by the time she said it. "We came to discuss the veil," she said. "Everything else follows from that." Dethron rose before the speaker could respond. This was the moment Wath had been dreading since the sensor alarm 9 days ago, though he couldn't have said exactly why until he watched it happen. The instant an institution built on 3,000 years of comprehensive knowledge decided it already understood something it had never actually looked at. "Ambassador," Dethron said, "the Council appreciates your candor. Given the scale of the threat you describe and the resources required to address it, the Council proposes that all relevant technology and research be transferred under concorded jurisdiction for the protection of concorded space." He said it as policy. It landed as a demand. Chen didn't answer immediately. She let the silence sit exactly as long as it needed to, the way she'd let every silence sit since Wath had first read her name off a screen. Then she stood and walked to the chamber entrance, and the whole thing that Wath had already glimpsed 9 days into the future, though he hadn't known it yet when he glimpsed it, began. "Councillor Dethron," Chen said, "I'd like to address your proposal." The chamber went quiet in the particular way 1,200 representatives go quiet when they sense, without being told, that something is about to be taken away from them that they hadn't known they were holding. "You can take our diplomatic personnel," Chen said. "You can probably take our 12 diplomatic vessels if your military assets at this coordinate move immediately." A pause, not for effect, for accuracy. "You cannot take 300 years of predecessor research, because it exists in distributed archives across 8,000 star systems, in regions your hyperlane network doesn't reach. You cannot take the technical expertise to apply that research, because that expertise lives in roughly 40,000 human scientists and engineers, and every one of them is out there too. And you cannot take the fence-building capability itself, which requires physical access to a network spanning territory your civilization has never once entered. No warning, no negotiation, no leverage left to take." Dethron's crest of silver filaments had gone rigid. Around the chamber, tactical feeds updated in silence. The human fleet, which had entered concorded space in a standard holding formation, had redistributed itself in the last 11 minutes into positions that made any attempt at seizure a war nobody could win quickly enough to matter. "What you can do," Chen said, "is the thing I came here to offer. A genuine partnership between two civilizations that each have what the other needs." She looked at Dethron. 3 seconds, long enough to be seen, not long enough to be theater. "I leave the calculation to you." She sat down. The mundane thing happened next, and it happened because Vethrin, watching from the terminal beside Wath, reached without looking for the tea she'd poured an hour earlier and found it had gone cold. She drank it anyway, out of habit, and set the cup back down without really noticing she'd done it. Then the chamber's silence broke, not with an answer, but with a request from the speaker's floor, a formal motion to recess for deliberation. It should have taken minutes. It took an hour. During that hour, every one of the 1,200 representatives received a data package they hadn't asked for. The full 3,000-year classified expedition record on survey notation 712 gamma, time-stamped and unaltered, showing exactly how a single junior surveyor's follow-up request had aged quietly out of a queue, decade after decade, for 8 centuries, until nobody remembered it had ever existed. Chen had prepared the transmission before her ship ever left the outer regions. She hadn't waited to see if the confrontation would happen. She'd assumed it would and built the response into her plan from the start. She knew, Wath said, watching the packet land on his own screen a moment after everyone else's. She knew this was coming before she ever set foot on this station. Vethrin didn't answer right away. She was looking at the same file Wath was, the 8 centuries of institutional silence laid out in a single unbroken document, and something in her posture had changed since the meeting on the buoy. She wasn't the archivist chasing an answer anymore. She was a person watching her own civilization's blind spot get measured in public by someone who had waited 300 years for the chance to do it kindly instead of by force. The recess ran long enough that Wath thought more than once that Dethron's faction might simply refuse to answer at all, might let the silence become its own kind of decision. That was the moment the mid-collapse hit, and it came from a direction nobody in the chamber had been watching. A representative near the back of the tiered ring stood. He hadn't spoken once in the entire session, not during Dethron's proposal, not during Chen's answer, not during the recess motion. His name, according to the roll, was Councillor Thren, and he'd held a seat for 110 years without ever once drawing attention to himself. "I have a question," Thren said, "for the human ambassador." Chen turned toward him. "Ask it." "You said this fence has 14 nodes on our side of the network, nodes that have never been activated." He paused. "Where are they?" Chen's answer was quiet, and it changed the shape of the room a second time. "2 of them," she said, "are less than a day's travel from where we're sitting right now." The silence after that wasn't the silence of a threat being weighed. It was the silence of a species realizing that the thing it needed to survive had been sitting inside its own territory the entire time, uncounted, the same way survey notation 712 Gamma had sat uncounted for 847 years. Not hidden, simply never looked at. Nobody resolved anything in that silence. Dethron didn't answer. The council didn't vote. The question just sat there, open, larger than the one it had replaced, and Wath understood, watching from his terminal a station away, that whatever came out of that recess room would not be the end of anything. It would only be the beginning of the actual work. Dethron did not answer during the recess. He answered 4 hours later, in front of the full reconstituted chamber, and the answer wasn't what he had walked in planning to say. "The Council withdraws the proposal to seize technology from the United Outer Systems," he said. His crest of silver filaments had gone flat against his brow, not raised, not rigid, just still. "The Council instead proposes a joint initiative, full partnership, equal standing." Nobody had expected the reversal to come from him. That was the detail Wath would think about later, turning it over the way he'd turned over the proximity alarm 9 days into what already felt like a different lifetime. Dethron hadn't been forced out. He'd read the transmitted records like everyone else, seen 8 centuries of his own institution's neglect laid bare in a document he couldn't argue with, and made the only choice left that didn't make him a fool twice. Speaker Ashavon called the vote. It passed by a margin large enough that Dethron's block of 187 had clearly split rather than held. "We accept your terms," Ashavon said, looking at Chen. "We are ready to begin." Before anyone began anything, there was tea to finish, because Vethrin had made a fresh cup an hour earlier, and this time she actually drank it, sitting beside Wath at the terminal, watching the vote tally settle into its final shape. It was such a small thing. It was the kind of small thing that made the last 9 days feel, for one quiet moment, like ordinary life again. Then Councillor Thren's question came back around, because open questions had a way of insisting on answers. The 2 dormant fence nodes he'd named, less than a day's travel from the chamber, turned out to sit inside a mapped but unremarkable system the Concorded had catalogued 400 years ago as an empty rock field. Nobody had ever landed there. Nobody had needed to. Ray's team confirmed the signature within the hour. Predecessor construction, dormant, waiting the same way the other 3,700 sites had waited, for someone to come back and look. "There'll be more," Rays told Wath, when the confirmation came through. Not just two. Once you know what to look for, half the empty rock fields in your surveys are going to turn out to be something else. The naming happened almost as an afterthought, in the way the important things sometimes do. Someone in the joint planning session needed a working title for the project that would spend the next decade finding, mapping, and activating every dormant node on the concorded side of the network. Dr. Reyes suggested it without much ceremony. "The Perimeter Initiative," she said, "since that's what it is." Nobody objected. It was such a plain name for something that would, if it worked, keep the veil away from 100 worlds. Neither species had finished counting yet. Admiral Sothkavar volunteered his fleet for the first survey run before anyone asked him to. "I came out here to establish dominance," he told Chen, at the edge of the planning room, not quite looking at her. "I'd rather spend the next 10 years doing something worth remembering instead." The last piece came from Reyes, 3 days after the vote, and it was the quietest reveal of all 9 days combined. Her team had spent 100 years learning to read predecessor signal architecture, and only in the last decade had they found the layer buried beneath the fence protocols themselves. Not a warning, not a set of instructions, but a message embedded in the oldest node they'd ever mapped, time-stamped by decay analysis to just over 100,000 years old. She read it to the small group gathered in Threshold Station 9's conference room, the same room where Chen had first said her sentence about assistance instead of survival. "Good, you found us. We knew someone would. We left this for you." That was all of it. No warning about the veil, because the fence itself was the warning. No instructions for what to build next, because the fence was already built, waiting 100,000 years for hands capable of finishing it. The predecessors hadn't died out, hadn't been destroyed by whatever the veil was. They had simply finished what they came to do, and moved on, and trusted that someone, eventually, would come looking in the dark places nobody else had bothered to check. Wath thought about survey notation 712 Gamma, 847 years old, closed and forgotten in an archive nobody read. He thought about the difference between a message nobody found because nobody looked, and a species that built its whole civilization out where nobody would find it until it was ready to be found. Humanity hadn't been hiding. They had been patient, the way the predecessors had been patient, for exactly long enough. There was no ceremony for what came after. No parade, no formal announcement broadcast across concorded space. Just work, the kind that took months to properly begin and decades to finish. Wath went back to Threshold Station 9 a week after the vote, back to the same terminal, the same overnight cataloging cycle he had run the night the alarm went off. The station's 400 million logged events had become 400,000,001, and would keep climbing, the way they always had. His task, that first week back, was smaller than anything he'd done during the 9 days that changed everything. Updating the Civilization Registry's classification schema to include a category that had never existed before. Not active, not developing, not predecessor, something new. He typed it in himself, the outer. Beneath it, he entered what they now knew. Humanity had been living there 400 years. The predecessors had been building there 100,000. And the fence, the real one, the finished one, would take another decade at least, built by human engineers and concorded scientists, and a dozen other civilizations the concorded had never once registered, all of them out past the edge of every hyperlane the concorded had ever mapped. Wath ran his thumb along the datapad's edge, the same worn groove that had outlasted 3 pads before this one, the same habit from 400 million routine events. The groove was still there. So was the work. He saved the entry, and the registry closed the file the way it always did, quietly, without ceremony, ready for the next update whenever it came. Outside the station's viewport, the dark went on the way it always had, unmapped past a certain distance, incomplete in all the old familiar places. Somewhere out there, past the edge of the network, 100,000 years of patience had waited for someone to look. Somewhere closer, A rock field that had sat empty on every survey for 400 years held a piece of a fence that would keep 100 worlds standing. Not in the well-lit corridors of established hyperlane networks, but in the unmapped dark, where the records had always been incomplete, and the most important things had always been written in the spaces between the lines.